And now I'm going to hand over to Alicia Wise, who is there and can introduce herself and her panel.
Thanks, Anthony. And thanks to John Vaughan for setting up, I think, the strategic context in which our speakers are highly influential and operating on a daily basis. International interest in the open access policies that will emerge here in the US, framed as public access policies, is high. And the outcomes of these discussions will impact the future of research and scholarship around the world. The devil is in the details. It can seem immediately obvious how to structure a public access policy, but to make one work in practice over the long term in ways that are affordable for all participants is quite a heady challenge. Today we have 4 highly influential people involved in these debates from different perspectives. First, we will have Amy Friedlander presenting the perspective of a funding body. She leads for the National Science Foundation on public access policy for full text. Then we'll have Howard Ratner presenting a publisher's perspective. Formerly from the Nature Publishing Group, he has now joined the Chorus Initiative as its development director. Third, we will have Judy Ruttenberg presenting the library perspective, or a library perspective, representing ARL and the SHARE project. And closing, we have John Wilbanks, who's presenting the researcher's perspective on these debates. He comes now from a small business, a startup, which is heavily reliant on access to information, in particular data. And I think he'll have an interesting perspective for all of us other stakeholders in what we should be thinking about as we move forward. We're going to save questions for the end. After the 4 speakers, we'll have 10 minutes at that time. So a challenge for you, we're looking for succinct, insightful questions that'll help us pull together the synergies or tease out the differences between these different perspectives.
Absolutely right.
And I'll be succinct and stop there too. Amy, over to you.
Good morning. Indeed, it works. Well, it's a pleasure to be back in Charleston, and it's a pleasure to be seeing so many friends who I know through email in 3 dimensions. There's really no substitution for real time. So let's get started. Not enough time for reminiscences of Charleston in the 1970s when I was a student here. So as you all know, on February 22nd of this year, the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a memo that provided guidance for enhancing access to the results of federal investments. And its terms are well known to you. Fundamentally, it asked us to balance public-private partnerships, to do all of this within existing budgets, to make publications available within a guideline of 12 months, although that could be changed based on criteria that have yet to be determined. And there are a number of other, and it asked us to have analytics, and it asked us to provide for unauthorized bulk download of articles and a number of other features. And I'm going to assume that you've all memorized it and read it to yourselves every night. So where are we? Well, I'm proud to report that the National Science Foundation indeed submitted its plan within the required 6 months. I can tell you it was roughly 2:05 in the afternoon of Thursday, the 22nd of August. Not that I had anything to do with this. The plans will be made public. My reading glasses? Plans will be made public after they are approved by OSTP and OMB. There may be a set of exchanges in between what is considered final. They will be posted on the NSF website as well as on the Open Government website at that time. And I am sad to tell you I have no more insight than you do on the timeline. So whereas I had hoped when I accepted Alicia's gracious invitation this summer to be talking to you about what we plan to do, today I'll be talking to you about how we developed the plan to do it. So how did we develop it? We had 4 modalities, if you will. We wanted to collaborate, we wanted to listen, we wanted and do continue to want to leverage existing resources and capabilities in the many sectors that are engaged in making information available to the public. And we wanted to learn from prior experience. So what did we do to collaborate? Well, it turns out that NSF had a bit of a head start on this. In the spring of 2012, you may know that our then director, Subra Suresh, organized something that is now called the Global Research Council. And public or open access was one of the areas of study that came out of that. And this provided us then an opportunity to begin looking foundation-wide at what it would mean to take the foundation into what you call, or what we call, a public access stance. So I talked, and it turned out, and as many of you may also know, some of the directorates had already begun to engage in this activity. The Math Physical Sciences Directorate, for example, was a leader in this area. I was then attached on detail to education and human resources, and I came back to my home directorate of social, behavioral, and economic sciences to work with Myron Gutman, the assistant director, who was then leading the initiative. So we had a period of about 8 to 10 months in which to understand a lot more about the agency and how public access would in fact affect every corner of the agency, and to seek out our counterparts at other federal agencies that in fact had also begun to think about what this meant. So when the memo finally appeared at noon on the 22nd, we were ready to begin to go, so to speak. And the group that we had formed with the other science agencies, NIST, NOAA, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NIH, NASA, we were the nucleus then of what became an interagency working group. This informal interagency working group was split into two broad components. There was one on publications and there was one on data. There tends, as you know, to see this issue as bifurcated into two tracks. We have publications over here and we have data over there, but we all know that they are intertwined and we should be thinking about them as a continuum of products resulting from federal investment. I was the executive secretary for both of the interagency groups, and then I had an interesting perspective on what was evolving. Within the foundation, a steering group was stood up to lead the development of the plan within the foundation. I was a member of that steering group, and then I chaired the subgroup on publications. In addition to that, we worked with our National Science Board, which is the policy-setting body. As part of the listening enterprise, you may also know that we organized two public sessions over a period of 4 days in May. And then we talked to a lot of you. In fact, the first people to come visit me were Spark, NCAR, and ARL. So I started with the library community. We had lots of publishers who came to visit us. We continued to talk to our program officers. And we talked to our administrative staff. Again, the implementation is going to ride on top of the already heavy workload of the NSF staff. So early on, it was apparent to us that we had to think of this not only in terms of its direct impacts on the immediate, if you will, consumers of what results from federal investment, but we had to look closely about the operations. And as we move into implementation now, very quietly, we're thinking more and more about the operational side of the house. So what were the issues that came up? Well, they're not going to surprise you. They are the usual ones. Was the repository going to be centralized or distributed? And in fact, when we went through that conversation, it wasn't just the specifics of how do you build a distributed repository. It had to do with a lot of questions about data management, data storage, and who has custody. Once you claim a federal right in something or claim federal ownership of something, not that we're claiming that, well, there are certain responsibilities and expectations that attach. Then who's going to have access, and access to what? This is, for the publication side, frequently comes down to a not so simple discussion, Alicia, not so simple discussion of the delay period or the period of the embargo. But again, when you link publications to data, it ceases to become how many months, but access to what. So let's take a few moments of my very short period and think about what happens when you publish an article in education, remembering that the National Science Foundation funds fundamental work in education. Well, educational data, as many of you know, is bounded not just by human subjects, the common rule, not just by HIPAA, not just by the CIPC, but also by legislation that specifically governs the management of educational data. So what do? You have a table that summarizes something, and we've said you have to make your data available. Well, what happens. There's lots of rules that restrict access to the underlying data, and they spill right over into publication. Other issues that came up have to do with compliance and metrics, what are the roles, and always, 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 we have to be aware of change. I'm afraid I'm going to bore with you that many times. And in fact, those of you in the room who are mathematicians will recognize the images on the slides as fractals. They're from the Mandelbrot set. And one of the significant properties of that set is that you can have a set of equations that end up in things that you can't predict. So I chose it, obviously, intentionally, not just because we funded the research. So what else can we leverage? Well, there's lots and lots of standards and best practices. I won't bore you by repeating the joke about the standards. We know there's a lot of work that's going on in the Research Data Alliance that will bear on the way we manage data and what we expect our investigators to do on behalf of data. And there are systems that we can look to. Now, I've been reproved for having said in the past that NSF does not have a repository. NSF, in fact, invests in many, many, many data repositories. However, we do not have anything analogous to the National Library of Medicine, to DTIC at the Department of Defense, to the National Agricultural Library, something that we support ourselves to support in-house researchers that can be used to manage the kind of item that we're talking about. So, of course, we started to look outside. Where could we borrow? Where could we partner? How could we collaborate? We looked to the private sector for key pieces of infrastructure, notably Crossref, FundRef, and ORCID, but there are others. And again, I come back to this notion that we have to be prepared to change. When we look at these systems, when we think about it, we ask the question, is this extensible? How will it accommodate change? What was the prior experience at NSF? As you may know, NSF is the premier, or we say we're the premier, civilian research agency that invests in all aspects of science and education. So we invest broadly in fundamental research in all aspects of science, not unclassified. And that means that our communities of researchers are highly heterogeneous. An economist really doesn't look like an engineer, and they don't necessarily look like a theoretical physicist. Their patterns of research are different, their expectations, the way they publish, the way they use information is different, and we need to be sensitive to that. We've been criticized, I know, because our data management plan seems to be quite abstract. It's abstract for a reason. It's so that many of the substantive decisions can be thrown back on the communities and exercised through the process of merit review. Other things about us, our preliminary research indicates two important things about our investigators. One is that they publish in a very broad variety of journals. I asked to see the list of publication venues for our investigators just for FY 11 and 12, and I was handed a list with 55,000 entries in it. Since there are only 23,000 journal titles, I'd say we have a disambiguation problem, but the point is made. The second thing we know is that our investigators are not exclusively NSF investigators. Most, if not all of them, have multiple sources of funding, and they have multiple sources of public funding. And this, in fact, is not unexpected. So if you go to our Geosciences Directorate, well, guess what? There's co-funding from NASA, right? Big surprise. If you go to our Biological Directorate, there's a lot of investment in NIH. NIH also shows up in engineering, things like robotics. NIH figures broadly in my home directorate of social behavioral, and so on. I won't bore you with the details. Other things that we can leverage from, from our background is our data management plan, the fact that we allow data to be reported at the same level of granularity as evidence in our biosketches, that data sets can be reported in annual and final reports, so we're trying to maintain parity between data and publications, and that we can accept article processing charges as a direct expense on an application in a budget proposal, which means should someone want to go gold, we have a way of helping that move forward, should that be a decision on the part of the investigator. Our approach, we hope, when we finally can share it with you, is open, flexible, and incremental. We expect to continue to communicate with you. We want to minimize burden on program officers, administrative staff. That means we align whenever possible with what we're already doing. And we need to have high-level coherence. The last thing we want is an investigator who does something that is funded by multiple agencies is to have to respond to different sets of rules, even though the agencies are also at the same time respectful of their own background. So in my last 15 seconds, I hope you will agree with me that this is a good thing. We hope in the end, it may be messy before we get there, to broaden access to research. We believe that information can be used to advance the Foundation's mission, and that this will provide a platform for innovation, and I think I'm on time.